England, 1786. Prisons were bursting at the seams. For decades, Britain had been sending its convicts to the American colonies. Then came independence, and that door slammed shut forever. So in 1787, they filled 11 ships with roughly 775 convicts and set course for the far side of the planet. An 8-month voyage across 15,000 miles of ocean. 48 people never made it. When the fleet finally dropped anchor, there were no European roads, no houses, no sign of any town, just the local Eora people and a vast, untouched harbor. What grew from that landing was built from scratch. Using old maps, paintings, drawings, and written records, we can piece together what it looked like back then. This was the beginning of Sydney, the penal colony, 1788 to 1800. January 26, 1788. The ships moor in Port Jackson, nothing familiar to anyone on board. A huge, sheltered harbor, deep water, thickly wooded shores, silence pierced only by the sounds of the fleet itself. Arthur Phillip, the commander, described it as the finest natural harbor he had ever seen. Looking at it today, it's difficult to disagree. 3 months after landing, a convict named Francis Fowles sketched the very first map of Sydney Cove. The 11 ships still riding at anchor, a handful of dirt paths, separate tent areas for men and women, saw pits, storehouses, a blacksmith's forge. Meanwhile, George Washington was being sworn in as America's first president, and the storming of the Bastille was only months away. That patch of tents and tracks was Sydney. 6 years later, another transported convict, Thomas Watling, sent for forging banknotes in Scotland, painted Sydney Cove straight from life. The tents had vanished. Brick buildings now stood along the water. The harbor was busy with shipping. A proper settlement was emerging. Watling wasn't impressed. He wrote back to Scotland that the place was barely a third the size of Dumfries, his hometown. He had a point, but growth was happening. This small brick building with its timber fence and 2 sentry boxes was Government House, the seat of power. Arthur Phillip ran the entire colony of more than 1,000 souls from here. Most were convicts transported for petty theft. Coats, boots, loaves of bread, guarded by roughly 200 Marines who were scarcely better off. Hardly the grand residence one expects, but it was enough to hold the fragile experiment together. By 1797, grain was being grown, but milling remained slow and inefficient. So they erected Sydney's first windmill on the ridge overlooking the cove, simply called Windmill Hill. The machinery came from England. A convict named John Davis constructed it. It could grind a bushel of wheat in 10 minutes. Down below, in what was called the rocks, convicts lived in modest stone and timber cottages after their day's government labor. They kept chickens and pigs, tended fenced vegetable plots, baked bread, forged tools, even ran small pubs. It felt more like a rough frontier village than a prison camp clinging to the sandstone cliffs. The windmill fell into disrepair after only 3 years, but the hill kept its name. Today, the Sydney Observatory sits on that same spot. By the end of the 1790s, men and women who had served their sentences were receiving small land grants, 30 acres, basic tools, a few supplies, and sent to clear farms around Parramatta. Tracks were being cut through thick bush. The Hawkesbury River farms were already producing before a proper road even reached them. Sydney Cove remained the arrival point for ships, goods, and news from the wider world. But the colony's center of gravity was drifting inland. 11 years after those first ships arrived with almost no food or plan, there were now scattered farms, rough roads, a second settlement at Parramatta, and a population approaching 5,000. It wasn't England, but it was starting to look permanent. The growth, 1800 to 1850. 15 years on from the first fleet, sandstone houses rose up the hillsides. Gardens were fenced. A working wharf bustled. Ships from 3 continents tied up in the same harbor that had once held only bush and silence. The population sat around 7,000. Trading vessels came regularly. The colony no longer depended solely on slow supply ships from Britain. It was beginning to trade on its own account. Convict transports continued, but free settlers, merchants, and sailors who chose to stay were arriving too. Some of the people who had once been sent here in chains now owned land and buildings. Remember that modest brick government house with the timber fence and sentry boxes? By 1807, it had been extended. A long drawing room added, a full-length veranda. Still damp, still cramped, every governor who lived there complained, but it served the colony for 56 years. The first Australian newspaper was printed inside its walls. The first laws were proclaimed from it. 9 governors resided and ruled there. The man who painted this view arrived as a convict transported for housebreaking. By 1807, he had received his pardon and was capturing the very building that had once controlled his life. 1 year later, January 26, 1808, exactly 20 years after the First Fleet, 400 soldiers marched down Bridge Street with band playing and bayonets fixed. They arrested Governor William Bligh in his bedroom. Australia's only military coup, the Rum Rebellion, sparked by a bitter fight over who controlled the rum trade. 20 years old, and the colony had already deposed its own governor. A hospital was desperately needed, but London refused to pay. Governor Macquarie cut a deal. 3 prominent merchants would finance and build it in return for the exclusive right to import 45,000 gallons of rum. No cash changed hands, purely paid in spirits. That's why it became known as the Rum Hospital. Work began in 1811. It took 5 years, largely because corners were cut so badly that sections nearly collapsed before opening. One of the 3 merchants was also the colony's principal surgeon. The man treating patients was profiting from the very rum that caused so much harm. The north wing of that building survives today as part of the New South Wales Parliament House. Those cannons in the foreground came from HMS Sirius, one of the original 11 ships of the First Fleet, wrecked off Norfolk Island in 1790. They were hauled back to Sydney and mounted at Dawes Point to protect the harbor. Below them lay the government dockyard, and behind that the growing town climbed the sandstone ridges. 30 years of construction captured from a single viewpoint. The 2 well-dressed figures are no longer convicts. They are free settlers, or people born in the colony, a new class of resident. This exact spot, where the cannons once stood, is now one of the pylons of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. While Bolivar was freeing South America and Napoleon languished in exile, Sydney remained a busy working harbour. A few hundred buildings, Aboriginal people still present on the edges, watching a settlement that had overtaken their world in 3 decades. Yet there was still no proper church. An early mud and stick chapel built in 1793 was torched by convicts 5 years later. The replacement was stone, with an awkward 150-foot round tower stuck on the front. Everyone agreed it looked wrong. Cheap materials, unskilled labor. It was widely mocked as the ugliest church in Christendom. From the heights you could see the sharp line where town ended and bush began. On one side, a British settlement, the only significant European foothold on a continent the size of Europe. On the other, country that had belonged to Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years. By 1819, the Eora were moving between both worlds, fishing in the harbor, trading on the fringes, but their numbers had already been devastated by smallpox in the colony's first year. Every structure in these early views was built by convict hands. By 1821, convicts and emancipists made up roughly 2/3 of the population. They quarried the stone, laid the roads, raised the churches, barracks, and hospital from dawn to dusk under armed overseers. Flogging was routine for slow work. Conditions varied wildly depending on assignment. A fortunate few, like the architect Francis Greenway, used their talents to build better lives. Most did not. Before 1819, convicts slept wherever they could, rented rooms, shanties, the open ground, making them impossible to track at night. Macquarie's answer was Hyde Park Barracks, 600 men in hammocks stacked 3 high, locked in after dark, marched out at dawn. Designed by Greenway himself, a convict building a prison for convicts. His work was so impressive that Macquarie granted him freedom. The barracks still stand today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That ridiculed church was soon overshadowed by something far finer. St. James's Church, completed 1824. Elegant Georgian sandstone, Hyde Park spreading in front, gas lamps flickering, carriages rolling past. Sydney no longer looked like a temporary camp. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, Government House on the left, Fort Macquarie on the point, ships from 4 continents filling the harbor, colonists promenading in fine clothes. Transportation of convicts to New South Wales had ended. Sydney was officially declared a city, population nearing 35,000. Sentences still had to be served by those already here, but no fresh ships were coming. The people in these scenes had chosen to be here, or had been born here. The penal colony era was over. What replaced it looked like this. 2 proper forts now guarded the harbor entrance. Dawes Battery on the left, using those old Sirius cannons. Fort Macquarie on the right, built 1817 on what is now Bennelong Point. After 60 years of makeshift defenses, they finally looked serious. That point where Fort Macquarie stood would later be demolished. Something rather famous would rise in its place. Everything and everyone arrived by sea. Every dispatch from London, every law, every order passed through this water. Government House flew the Union Jack high on the hill, a clear message: you are still part of the British Empire, just a very long way from home. The damp, complaining old Government House was finally pulled down in 1846. Its replacement was deliberately grand, Gothic revival with battlements and towers, made to resemble a small English castle set down in the Australian bush. The symbolism was unmistakable. While colonies across Latin America broke from Spain and Europe burned with revolution, Sydney raised the Union Jack and carried on. A proper Supreme Court finally opened in 1827, right beside St. James's Church on the civic square Macquarie had planned. Hyde Park, the oldest public parkland in Australia, had once been a convict racetrack. Now it fronted sandstone columns and a Chief Justice. Both buildings remain in use today. George Street, the same dirt track that linked the first tents in 1788, was now lined with shops, hotels, offices, and horse-drawn traffic. In 1842, Sydney was officially proclaimed a city, though reliable sewers and widespread gaslighting were still years away. From Flagstaff Hill, the working waterfront stretched below, the harbor beyond, the Blue Mountains faint on the horizon, 60 kilometers west. Miller's Point was the rough end. Docks, warehouses, sailors, laborers. The harbor that had sustained the colony for half a century remained its lifeblood. Wool flowed out, immigrants flowed in, vessels arrived from London, Calcutta, Canton, the Cape. The hero of Waterloo Pub, built 1843 from convict-quarried sandstone, still stands, one of Australia's oldest. Legend says it had a trapdoor behind the bar for shanghaiing drunk sailors straight onto ships bound for China. The Tank Stream, the freshwater creek that made Arthur Phillip choose this exact cove in 1788, was by the 1850s a foul, rubbish-choked drain running behind buildings, long superseded by other sources and largely forgotten. The road west to Parramatta now had a toll gate. Growth had reached the point where infrastructure cost money. A man sat in the round booth all day collecting coins from passing carts. In 1788, there was nothing beyond this point but wilderness. By the 1850s, there was a maintained road and someone charging you to use it. That's progress. After the gold rush, 1850 to 1901, Gold was discovered at Bathurst in 1851. Within 4 years, Sydney's population had doubled. Ships arrived daily. People flooded in from Britain, America, China. George Street transformed almost overnight from Colonial Main Street to Boomtown Thoroughfare. 67 years from a cluster of tents to this. The gold rush didn't create Sydney. It supercharged what was already there. 100 years after the first fleet, 400,000 people, steam and sail vessels jammed 30 deep in the harbor, factories smoking, railways spreading, cathedrals rising. The town hall clock tower dominates the center. St. Mary's Cathedral climbs skyward on the right, still unfinished. Sydney was perpetually under construction. To prove to the world what it had become, the colony built the Garden Palace in 1879 to 80, modeled on London's Crystal Palace. A 65-meter dome, 14,000 exhibits from 34 countries, more than 1 million visitors in 7 months in a population of 700,000. Then, at 5:40 a.m. on September 22, 1882, fire broke out. The entire structure was consumed in 40 minutes. Government archives, museum collections, early census records, all turned to ash. Witnesses said the statue of Queen Victoria was the last thing standing, engulfed in flames, before it too collapsed. The cause was never determined. January 1, 1901. Sydney Town Hall illuminated for the birth of a nation. 6 separate British colonies voted to unite as the Commonwealth of Australia. Still under the Crown, still a dominion, but now with its own federal parliament, prime minister, and flag. 113 years after 11 ships anchored in an empty harbor, the continent had a country. No war of independence, no violent revolution, just a referendum, a ceremony, and a great many lights. That's very much the Australian way. Thank you for watching. Drop a comment below. What city or era should we reconstruct next?